Amazon Prime's House of David series begins the back half of its strong debut season this week with episode number 5, The Wolf and the Lion. We may not have a giant sighting this week, but we've got some forbidden romance, some crazy king antics, some political intrigue, and what I think is just a missed opportunity for the show. There's a lot going on, so let's talk about it. So let me start off by saying that I got a kick out of how this episode opens. During what appears to be, I think, sunset, you have David sitting on the top of the palace walls, and he's just belting out some song as people in the palace below, gaze up at him. And I think for any of us that grew up going to church youth group camps, I think we all know that guy that just feels like it's his divine calling to pull out his acoustic guitar and serenade the world while everyone else is just trying to enjoy a little bit of peace and quiet. But that aside, this is another solid, well-made episode. To me, this show is now 5 for 5. I think, like last week, it is a slower episode and perhaps the least action-packed of the series so far. But I love me some good political intrigue, which I think when done well can be no less compelling drama than merely having some warrior dudes whack each other with swords, although I'm also ready for some of that too. And it does seem like the Goliath storyline, which has mostly been set aside recently, will finally be picked up again next week. Episode 5 is an enjoyable episode, but I think notably it's also one that probably goes the most off of the biblical script, featuring plot lines that, to my knowledge, are wholly imagined for the show. Because as far as I can tell, the episode seems to take place between the biblical events described in 1 Samuel chapter 17 and 18. And initially, as I was watching this episode, I thought it was trying to maybe rework some of the material of 1 Samuel 18, 17, and 18 regarding the fate and the marriage of Eliab, who is Saul's oldest daughter, and with us be bypassing some of the later biblical details. But I think the way that the episode ultimately does play out, I'm not sure that that's actually the case. So I think this episode may, add to the biblical narrative around the fringes, but I'm not sure that it alters the existing material in any kind of meaningful way. And the episode really does sort of play up the forbidden romance angle introduced last week between David and Michal. I did get a few comments, I think, in my last week's review from people who really just didn't like the show making, David illiterate and having Michal teach him. Although, personally, I just don't really have a problem with it. I think, given his prolific psalm writing and, later royal functions, we can probably assume that he wasn't illiterate, but the Bible doesn't really say for sure either way. And I do like that it gives the relationship kind of a connection between the two characters beyond just sort of, more Disney-esque physical attraction. And to me, another welcome development in this episode is that we've got some humor, because let me tell you, King Saul, he's got some jokes. I think him kind of not knowing the name of the man he is offering his daughter to marry, and then later telling the leader of Judah to just shut up and read the scroll are just both really great moments. And they also just made me realize that I think humor is one thing that this show has been missing so far. It's had action and romance and drama and most of the classic cinema things, but it's all being fairly grim and serious, so I'm glad for at least a little bit of levity. And speaking of Saul, I don't think I've really mentioned actor Ali Suleiman much in my review so far, but he has been fantastic. I think he's been bringing his A game, and to me, he is the clear MVP of this episode. I really love just the nuance of his character so far, because he's clearly an imperfect man that's destined, I think in some ways, to be the antagonist of this series. But he's not really a bad man. He's still a husband and a father, and I think still in his own way, a man that wants to be a good king. And I think this episode's best scene is actually the one between him and his daughter Eliab. It's a very quiet moment that doesn't necessarily move the plot forward, but it just really allows his humanity to shine out, and I think gives both of those characters more depth. I also like that kind of in each episode it seems he has one real good quote just about kingship, and this week it's the statement, "To be a king is to be misunderstood," which I think is just some really great dialogue. He has several good scenes, I think, with David this week too. I like that while he doesn't take David at all seriously, as like a possible match to marry his daughter. He does ask his opinion on like which of the eligible sons is the best suitor. I think he obviously sees himself as superior, but he still treats David with respect, and I think even like a hint of friendship, which I do think will like pay off later in this series. As far as themes, I think the underlying like motif in episode 5 is really all about like the tension between like duty and destiny. I think it's summed up well in the quote from Michal telling David, "We are who we are, nothing can change that. I have a duty and so do you." And in like various ways, almost all of like the central characters are faced with that like conflict between duty and destiny. You have Eliab, who has like a duty to protect David's destined future, but also to keep the rest of his family safe. Both Michal and Merab feel like a duty to their father to marry, while also wanting to like follow their own hearts. And even like the queen has a duty to like her religion and like to the law, but then is tempted to use dark magic to maintain like the royal power that she kind of feels like is her family's destiny. You probably see the theme like most clearly with David himself, who struggles in this episode to like live as like an overlooked, underappreciated shepherd boy when he just knows in his heart that like, he's destined for so much more. I think it's an interesting struggle for the show to explore, given that like the original biblical text largely like skips over this time period. So there's just not much time between like his anointing and then like him ultimately achieving greatness. But unfortunately, this brings me to really my one gripe with this episode, and that is the ending. I think the final scene of this episode appears to set up like a really powerful contrast between Saul and David, but then it undercuts it with its like very final closing moments. Because when asked by Saul to like sit on the throne and just see what it feels like, David initially refuses and says, "That is for the Lord's anointed." And I think thematically, it's a moment that really effectively, I think, establishes like the differences between Saul, who is acting in rebellion to God and like his selfish desire to like cling to his throne and power, and then David, who doesn't see kingship as like his personal right, but instead waits for God's timing, even when it seems hard to imagine that that day will ever come. And it's a really fantastic moment until David sits on the throne. And I get it that David is not really being dishonest or anything, since he is, in fact, the Lord's anointed. But to me, kind of having him actually sit on the throne just feels like the more predictable, crowd-pleasing, like Hollywood route, rather than the more subtle and I think nuanced thematic one. And maybe I'm just like nitpicking, and you guys are welcome to tell me just how wrong I am, but at least to me, I think it would have been a far more powerful ending of the episode to have stopped with David just like brushing the thrones with his finger, but then ultimately choosing not to sit in it, kind of willing himself to wait for God's timing rather than seeking to claim that destiny for himself. But lastly, kind of like I did last week, I have a few other sort of miscellaneous random thoughts and observations about the episode. As I established last week, I am a proud card-carrying member of the Eliab fan club, and my boy did not let me down in this episode either, because he is once again just the man. And honestly, it's probably a good thing that like Amazon didn't put me in charge of being the showrunner for this series, because the series probably would have strayed, further from the biblical source material and simply being called the House of Eliab. And finally, the show is really leaning into like the David being a bastard thing. I think narratively, it makes sense that like if that is a revelation introduced in the show, then it would continue to be an important part of his character. But I still find it a little bit surprising that it has been elevated to like such a definitive and like central thing, given how like uncertain and like speculative it is in the biblical text. Personally, I feel like it maybe would have been better to have left it like more ambiguous in the show, and perhaps the show still will, because I can't remember for certain, but I'm not sure that it's ever been proven as like 100% factual, or if it's just sort of being the assumption of David and like the people around him. So hey, who knows? But overall, this show continues to deliver like solid entertainment and compelling drama. I think with just like 3 episodes left and some massive, or should I say some giant plot elements on the horizon, I'm still excited to see what happens next. And I think if the show can keep sort of this momentum and like quality going until the end, I think the show really does have potential to be something special. But hey, we'd love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this episode, or hey, maybe you didn't enjoy it as much as the other ones, don't be shy, jump into the comment section, let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't done so too, encourage you guys, become a Collider, subscribe to the channel, got lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got some interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching, stay safe, and continue to collide through the world for Christ.